Welcome. You don't need to do anything right now. You don't need to solve anything, answer anything, or be anywhere other than exactly where you are. You can let the weight of the day settle slowly through you, the way warmth leaves a stone after sunset, gradually without drama, until only a gentle residue remains. Tonight, we are going to spend time with one of the most extraordinary minds that ever existed on this earth. Not extraordinary in the way of conquerors or emperors, not extraordinary in the way of people who accumulated wealth or built vast physical things. Extraordinary in a quieter, deeper way, in the way of someone who looked at the world with such sustained and patient and honest attention that the looking itself became a kind of revolution. A revolution that is still unfolding, 24 centuries after the man who started it drank a cup of poison and lay down to die in an Athenian prison cell, as calm as if he were simply going to sleep. His name was Socrates. He was born in Athens around 470 BCCE, the son of a stonecutter named Sophoniscus and a midwife named Phanerete. He was not handsome. Ancient sources agree on this with some relish, describing him as stocky and wide-nosed and somewhat resembling a satyr, the wild woodland spirits of Greek mythology. He did not dress elegantly. He walked barefoot, winter and summer, through the streets and agoras and gymnasiums of Athens, wearing the same plain cloak, regardless of season. He owned almost nothing. He wrote nothing. Not a single word, attributed to him, survives in his own hand. And yet there is a reasonable argument to be made that no human being in the history of Western civilization has had a more profound, more lasting, or more personally transformative influence on the way human beings think about themselves, their lives, and their world. How is that possible? How does a man who wrote nothing, owned nothing, held no office, commanded no army, and built no monument, leave a mark so deep that 2,500 years later, educated people all over the world are still reading about him, still arguing about what he meant, still finding in his recorded conversations an intimacy and a provocation that feels, impossibly, improbably, alive? That is the question we are going to explore tonight. Not as a lecture, not as a dry recitation of facts and dates, but as a long, slow, meditative journey through the life and mind of a man who believed, with every quiet fiber of his being, that the most important thing any human being can do is to examine their own life honestly and without flinching, and that a life lived without that examination is, in his memorable phrase, not worth living. We will walk the streets of ancient Athens with him. We will sit in the gardens and porticos where he taught. We will listen in on his conversations, the strange, circling, sometimes maddening dialogues in which he would claim to know nothing, and then proceed, through patient questioning, to dissolve everything his conversational partner thought they knew. We will meet the people who loved him and the people who feared and resented him. We will watch, in the end, his trial and his death, and try to understand what his death meant, then and now. And we will sit, throughout all of this, with the questions he asked, the questions that do not have easy answers, the questions that are valuable precisely because they cannot be answered quickly or comfortably, because engaging with them requires the kind of slow, honest, sometimes uncomfortable inner work that most of us spend our days successfully avoiding. But not tonight. Tonight, there is nothing to avoid. There is only the quiet, and the story, and the slow breathing of a mind that found, in the very act of wondering, something that felt like peace. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your breath find its own rhythm. And let Socrates come forward, out of the ancient world, sandals in hand, ready to ask you the question he asked everyone he met. How are you living? And, even more to the point, why? Before we can understand Socrates, we need to understand Athens. Not the Athens of ruins and tourist photographs, the bleached marble, and the empty pediments, but Athens as it was, in the middle of the 5th century BCE, a living, breathing, quarrelsome, brilliant, morally complicated city, at the peak of its power and self-confidence. Imagine yourself standing in the Agora, the great public square, at the heart of Athens, on a bright morning in the year 440 BCE. Socrates would have been around 30 years old. Athens itself would have been, to your eyes, a place of startling visual richness and surprising human density. The sky above you is deeply blue, the way Aegean skies are in the dry Greek summer, and the air smells of dust and olive oil, and the faint sweetness of baking bread from the stalls along the Agora's northern edge. Around you, several hundred people move in the complex social choreography of a morning market. Vendors selling pottery, fish, bread, honey, cloth, and bronze implements. Lawyers and their clients huddled in conversation under the painted colonnade of the Stoa Poikile. Philosophers and Sophists gathering small audiences for their debates, politicians working the crowd, slaves running errands for distant households, foreign merchants haggling over the price of grain. Above it all, on the great limestone rock of the Acropolis, the Parthenon is gleaming. Not the ruin it is today, but the complete building, its marble still white and slightly warm to the touch, its sculptures still painted in vivid reds and blues and golds, the colossal ivory and gold statue of Athena inside it, still radiating divine light through the temple's open doorway. The Parthenon had been completed just a few years earlier, the crowning achievement of Pericles' ambitious building program, the physical expression of Athens' belief in its own greatness. And Athens had reason, in the 440s BCE, to believe in its greatness. Just 40 years earlier, the city had been part of an alliance that repelled not one, but two massive Persian invasions of Greece, at Marathon, at Thermopylae, at Salamis, at Plataea. These victories, won against an empire of vastly greater size and resources, had given Athens a sense of providential destiny, a feeling of being singled out by fate for something exceptional. The democracy established by Cleisthenes and expanded by Ephialtes, the system in which adult male citizens voted directly on laws and policies, served on juries, and held public offices by lot, was the most radical experiment in self-governance the world had ever seen. And now, under the leadership of Pericles, the brilliant, aristocratic, coolly intelligent statesman who would dominate Athenian politics for 30 years, Athens was transforming itself from a regional power into an empire. The Delian League, an alliance formed to defend the Greek world against Persia, had become, under Athenian management, something closer to an Athenian protection racket. Allied cities paid tribute to Athens, and Athens spent the tribute partly on the common defense and partly on the Parthenon and the Propylaea, and the extraordinary flowering of art, architecture, drama, and philosophy that makes the Periclean age one of the most creative periods in all of human history. Into this world, this brilliant, expansive, confident, ethically complicated world, Socrates was born and grew to maturity. His father, Sophoniscus, was a stonemason, and it is possible, plausible certainly, that a young Socrates worked alongside his father on the construction projects that were reshaping Athens during his youth. Some ancient sources describe Socrates as having trained as a sculptor and attribute to him the carved group of the three Graces that was reportedly displayed at the entrance to the Acropolis for many centuries. Whether or not this specific attribution is accurate, the image is a meaningful one. Socrates, as a maker of forms from hard material, a young man who spent his early years learning to impose order and beauty on the resistant world of stone. Later, he would work with a different and far more resistant material, the human mind. His mother, Phainaret, was a midwife, and this detail, too, is one that Socrates would return to throughout his life, with a particular quality of attention that suggests it meant something deep to him. A midwife, he would say, does not give birth herself. She helps others to give birth to what is already inside them. She does not create the child. She creates the conditions in which the child can come into the world. This is what I do with ideas, Socrates would explain to those who asked what exactly he was doing in all those conversations in the Agora and the gymnasia and the private houses of Athens. I don't give anyone wisdom. I help them give birth to the wisdom that is already inside them. He called this method myeutics, from the Greek word for midwifery. The metaphor is one of the most beautiful and precise in the history of philosophy, and it tells us something essential about the man, that he understood his work from the very beginning, not as a transmission of knowledge from teacher to student, but as a collaborative excavation, a joint project of discovery carried out between two people who were willing to be honest with each other about what they actually knew and what they merely thought they knew. This understanding that wisdom is not transmitted, but uncovered, not poured in from outside, but drawn out from within, is itself a profound philosophical claim, and it is one of the threads we will follow throughout tonight's journey. Athens gave Socrates the world in which to do this work, a world of leisure and democracy and public discourse, where an ordinary citizen could spend his days in conversation about justice and beauty and virtue without anyone officially stopping him. A world, too, of enormous cultural ferment. The great dramatists Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were his near contemporaries, writing their tragedies and comedies in the theater of Dionysus, on the south slope of the Acropolis, while Socrates walked the streets below. The historian Herodotus was working on his great account of the Persian Wars. The physician Hippocrates was laying the foundations of Western medicine on the island of Kos. It was a world charged with possibility, vibrating with the energy of a civilization inventing itself, making itself up as it went along, arguing fiercely about what it was and what it wanted to be. And Socrates walked through all of it, barefoot and questioning, with a quality of attention so intense and so honest that people found it both irresistible and deeply, profoundly unsettling. Let us walk alongside him for a while. There is a moment, somewhere in the early part of Socrates' adult life, that he himself identified as the pivot point of his existence, the moment that set the direction of everything that followed. A friend of his, a young man named Chaerephon, described in the dialogues as enthusiastic and somewhat impulsive, traveled to Delphi. The oracle at Delphi was the most revered sacred site in the Greek world, a temple of Apollo built on a mountainside in central Greece, where a priestess called the Pythia sat on a tripod above a fissure in the rock and, in a state of prophetic trance, delivered the oracular pronouncements of the god. The oracle had shaped Greek history for centuries. Kings and generals and politicians had come to Delphi before major decisions, seeking divine guidance, and the Pythia's answers, always ambiguous, always requiring interpretation, had sent armies to war and empires to ruin. Chaerephon asked the oracle a question, a simple question, but one with enormous consequences. He asked, "Is there anyone wiser than Socrates?" The oracle's answer was equally simple and equally consequential. "No," said the Pythia, "there is no one wiser." When Socrates heard this, and we have his own account of his reaction in Plato's Apology, the text that records his speech at his trial, his first response was not pride or satisfaction. It was bewilderment, because Socrates was convinced that he knew nothing, not in the false modest way that clever people sometimes claim ignorance, while clearly expecting to be contradicted. In a genuine working sense, Socrates had spent years questioning everyone he could find: politicians, poets, craftsmen, generals, philosophers, and had come to the uncomfortable conclusion that none of them knew what they claimed to know, and that he himself was no different. He was ignorant. So what could the god possibly mean? He decided to investigate. He began, systematically, to seek out the people who were reputed to be wise: the great statesmen of Athens, the acclaimed poets, the master craftsmen, and to question them carefully about the subjects in which their wisdom was supposed to reside. What he found, again and again, disturbed him profoundly. The politicians knew how to win arguments and manage coalitions, but when pressed on questions of fundamental principle, what is justice? What makes a governance decision right? They could not give coherent answers. The poets composed verses of great beauty and emotional power, but when asked what their verses meant, they seemed as surprised by the content as their audiences were. Inspiration, it seemed, was not the same as understanding. The craftsmen, the carpenters, the smiths, the potters, genuinely knew their crafts, and Socrates respected this. But they had made the mistake, so natural and so fatally common, of assuming that expertise in one domain conferred wisdom in all others. After this long investigation, Socrates arrived at a conclusion that he found simultaneously humbling and, in a strange way, liberating. The oracle was right. He was the wisest person in Athens, not because he knew more than anyone else. He didn't. But because he alone knew that he knew nothing. Everyone else labored under the double burden of ignorance and the mistaken belief that they were not ignorant. Socrates had the first burden, but had freed himself from the second. This is the famous Socratic paradox. I know that I know nothing. And while it is often quoted as a clever aphorism or a piece of performative humility, it is worth sitting with as a genuine philosophical position. Because what Socrates is pointing toward is not a counsel of despair or a declaration that knowledge is impossible. He is pointing towards something more subtle and more important: that the precondition for genuine learning is the honest recognition of genuine ignorance. You cannot fill a cup that you believe is already full. You cannot find something that you believe you already have. The first step towards wisdom is not the acquisition of new information. It is the clearing away of the false certainty that prevents you from seeing clearly. This is a lesson that psychology has confirmed in the 25 centuries since Socrates drew his conclusion in the Agora of Athens. The psychologist David Dunning and his colleague Justin Kruger identified, in a famous 1999 study, a cognitive bias, now known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with limited knowledge in a domain tend to overestimate their competence, while people with genuine expertise tend to be more modest about what they know. The less you actually understand about something, the more confidently you believe you understand it. Expertise, paradoxically, teaches you primarily how much you don't know. Socrates had identified this dynamic in his own informal and conversational way 2.5 millennia earlier. But the oracle at Delphi was not the only divine or mysterious element in Socrates' self-understanding. There was also what he called his daimon, a word usually translated as divine sign or inner voice. Not a demon in the modern sense, with its connotations of evil, but something closer to what we might call an inner conscience or an intuitive warning system. Socrates described it as a voice, or perhaps more accurately, a kind of presence, a subtle inner signal that occasionally intervened in his decision-making. And crucially, it only intervened negatively. It never told him what to do. It only told him sometimes what not to do, when he was about to take an action that would somehow be wrong for him, even if he could not yet articulate why. The daemon would give him a signal, a restraining feeling, a nudge toward stopping. What are we to make of this? Socrates' contemporaries took the daemon seriously as a genuine divine communication, and it would later become one of the charges against him at his trial, that he introduced new divine beings to Athens. Modern readers tend to interpret it through various lenses. A Jungian might see it as a communication from the unconscious, the deeper, wiser parts of the mind, speaking through intuitive feelings to the rational surface self. A modern cognitive scientist might describe it as the system of pattern recognition that operates below conscious awareness, occasionally producing signals that we experience as gut feelings or intuitions. A religious or spiritual reader might take it as exactly what Socrates said it was, a form of divine guidance. What is interesting philosophically is not which of these interpretations is correct. They may all be partially right. But what Socrates made of the experience. He didn't build a religion around it. He didn't establish himself as a prophet or a conduit of divine revelation. He treated the daemon as one piece of evidence, one more thing to be examined honestly and carefully in the context of a larger inquiry. The daemon was not an excuse to stop thinking. It was a prompt to think harder. The voice within and the voice of the oracle, the inner life and the outer world, the private intuition and the public tradition, both pointed in the same direction, toward the life of inquiry, the life of honest examination, the life that would cost him everything and give him, in his own estimation, something worth far more. As you breathe slowly in the quiet of this night, consider for a moment your own daemon, the quiet signals your own deep self sometimes sends, the times you knew, somehow without quite knowing how you knew, that something was right or wrong before you could articulate the reason, the voice you sometimes listen to and sometimes don't. Socrates listened to his. It didn't always make his life easier, but it made it his. Let us go to the Agora on a warm afternoon. The light is slanting, golden, the kind of afternoon light that makes even the dust hanging in the air seem like something worth noticing. Socrates is there, as he usually is, standing in the shade of the painted stoa, with a small knot of people around him. He has found someone to talk to, a successful merchant named, let us say, Cephalus, a man of middle age and comfortable means, respected in the community, confident in his opinions. You look well, Socrates says to Cephalus. I am well, thank you, says Cephalus. Business is good. I have been fortunate. That's wonderful, says Socrates. And tell me, you are a man of reputation in this city, a man people respect. What is it, would you say, that makes you respected? What is the quality that people admire in you? Well, says Cephalus, pleased to be asked, I think I am known as an honest man, an honorable man. I try to act justly. Excellent, says Socrates, and you have been acting justly for many years. So you must know quite a lot about justice. Could you tell me, what is justice exactly? And here begins the dance. Cephalus offers a definition. Justice is telling the truth and paying your debts. Socrates, very politely, very gently, produces a counterexample. Suppose a friend lends you his sword when he is sane, and then comes to reclaim it in a fit of madness, planning to harm someone. Would it be just to return it? Surely not. And yet by Cephalus's definition it would be, since you would be paying your debt. So Cephalus's definition cannot be quite right. Cephalus, flustered, refines his definition. Justice is giving to each person what they are owed. Socrates, still gentle, still apparently humble, still claiming only to be trying to understand, finds another problem with this. What is owed can mean different things in different contexts. The definition needs to be more precise. And on it goes, through several more refinements, each one dissolving under the pressure of Socrates' patient questioning. until finally Cephalus either gives up in frustration or admits, and this is the crucial moment, that he doesn't actually know what justice is. He's been acting justly for 40 years. He believes in justice, he values justice, and he cannot define it. This is the Socratic method. This is what the Greeks called elenchus, cross-examination, refutation, a careful testing of definitions and claims. And it is both more humble and more radical than it might initially appear. The elenchus begins with a question. Always a what is it question. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? What is beauty? What is knowledge? These are not trivial questions, despite their apparent simplicity. They are the foundational questions of ethics and philosophy, the questions that everything else depends on. You cannot discuss whether a law is just without knowing what justice is. You cannot admire someone's courage without knowing what courage is. You cannot act rightly without understanding what rightness means. And what the elenchus reveals, again and again, is that most people, even people who have spent their lives apparently embodying these virtues, cannot give a coherent account of what those virtues are. They know, in a practical sense, what it feels like to act courageously. They can identify instances of justice, but the underlying concept, the essential nature that makes an action just rather than merely kind, or courageous rather than merely bold, they cannot articulate. Why does this matter? Socrates had a view, deeply controversial then, and still provocative now, that it matters enormously. His position was that you cannot reliably and consistently do good unless you understand what good is. Virtue is a form of knowledge, he believed. The person who acts justly by habit or convention, but does not understand justice, is not truly virtuous. They are virtuous by accident, and they are only one bad argument or unusual circumstance away from going badly wrong. True virtue requires understanding, and understanding requires the kind of honest, rigorous examination that the elenchus provides. This view, that virtue is knowledge, sounds strange, perhaps even offensive, to modern ears, attuned to a different model of ethics, one that places feeling and intuition alongside or above reason in the moral life. But sit with it for a moment, because there is something important in it. Think about the difference between a person who doesn't steal because they've never had an opportunity, and a person who doesn't steal because they have examined the question of property and rights and human dignity, and arrived at a principled understanding of why theft is wrong. The second person is more reliably good. They are good not just in the circumstances they've encountered, but in principle. They understand why, and that understanding is portable, applicable to new situations, resistant to rationalization and self-deception in a way that mere habit is not. Socrates was not saying that emotion and feeling are irrelevant to ethics. He was saying that they are not sufficient, that they need to be informed and guided by genuine understanding, that the examined life, the life in which you ask, regularly and honestly, why you believe what you believe and value what you value, is morally superior to the unexamined one, not because it feels better, but because it is more likely to actually produce good. The people who hated Socrates did not hate him because his questions were unanswerable. They hated him because his questions revealed something uncomfortable, that the beliefs and values they had taken for granted, the certainties on which they had built their self-respect and their social identity, were not as solid as they had assumed, that the philosophical floor beneath their feet had gaps in it they had never noticed because they had never looked down. Socrates made people look down, not cruelly, not contemptuously, but insistently, with a patient kindness that was somehow more penetrating than cruelty would have been. And as you settle deeper into the night, into the soft, undemanding warmth of rest, here is a question to carry gently with you. What is one thing you believe strongly about yourself, about what matters, about how people should live, that you have never really examined, that you hold because you were taught it, or because it's comfortable, or because everyone around you holds it? You don't need to answer it tonight. Just feel the shape of the question, the way it opens something slightly. That opening is exactly where Socrates liked to begin, above the entrance to the temple at Delphi, carved into the stone, in letters that every Greek, who ever made the pilgrimage there, had to walk beneath, was a short two-word inscription. Gnothes Seiouden. Know thyself. These two words, this simple, apparently obvious imperative, were, for Socrates, the foundation of everything, the starting point, the constant reference, and the ultimate goal of the philosophical life. Not know the stars, or know the gods, or know the laws of nature, though all of these were worthy subjects of inquiry. Know yourself. Know the particular, unrepeatable, complicated, often self-deceiving creature that is looking out through your eyes and making your decisions and constructing the story of your life. But what does it mean to know yourself? This is a question that sounds simple and turns out to be one of the deepest and most difficult that a human being can ask. And Socrates spent his entire adult life circling it from different angles, in different conversations, approaching it through the back door of questions about virtue and justice and beauty, always returning finally to this, that all wisdom begins with honest self-knowledge, and that honest self-knowledge is extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily hard to achieve. Why is it so difficult? The answer, which both ancient Greek philosophy and modern psychology converge on, with surprising unanimity, is that the self has a profound and deep interest in its own good opinion of itself. We are not neutral observers of our own minds. We are motivated observers, motivated to see ourselves in the best possible light, to explain our failures as the product of circumstances and our successes as the product of character, to hold our beliefs as the results of careful reasoning, when they are often the results of cultural inheritance or emotional convenience. The psychologist Timothy Wilson calls this the adaptive unconscious, the vast, largely inaccessible portion of our mental processing that influences our behavior, our feelings, and our beliefs in ways that our conscious minds cannot directly observe. We know, in a limited sense, that we have an unconscious. We have all had the experience of being surprised by our own reactions, of discovering that we feel something we didn't expect to feel, of recognizing a pattern in our behavior that we had not previously noticed. But the full extent of what happens below the surface of consciousness, and the degree to which it shapes what we experience as deliberate, rational decision-making, is something that even the most self-aware person can only partially grasp. Socrates, without any of the apparatus of modern psychology, was pointing at the same truth, that we are opaque to ourselves in crucial ways, that the beliefs we are most certain of are often the ones most in need of examination, precisely because their certainty indicates they have not been questioned, that they have been protected from scrutiny by the emotional investment we have in them. But there is something more specific, too, in what Socrates meant by knowing yourself. He was interested particularly in the question of what kind of person you are, what your values actually are, as opposed to what you think they are, or claim them to be. He drew a distinction, repeatedly and in various ways, across his dialogues, between what people say they value and what their actions reveal they value, between professed virtue and lived virtue, between the person you believe yourself to be and the person you actually are, revealed in the choices you make when it costs you something to choose well. This distinction is psychologically exact. We are, most of us, somewhat different people, in moments of comfort and moments of genuine cost. the values we hold when nothing depends on them, the beliefs we articulate in comfortable conversations, are not always the same values we act on when acting on them requires sacrifice or risk, or the willingness to be unpopular. And the gap between our professed values and our lived values is, Socrates thought, the most important thing a person can know about themselves. Because until you know the gap, until you see clearly where your actions diverge from your principles, you cannot even begin the work of closing it. This is the specific practical content of the commandment to know yourself, not a mystical injunction to discover your true nature in some deep metaphysical sense. A practical demand. Watch yourself honestly. Notice what you actually do, not just what you intend to do. Notice the gap between your stated values and your lived choices, and do not look away from what you see. This is uncomfortable work. Of all the things the examined life requires, this clear-eyed watching of oneself is perhaps the most demanding. It requires a particular kind of courage, not physical courage, but intellectual and moral courage, the willingness to see things about yourself that you would rather not see. Socrates had this courage in abundance, and he asked it of everyone he spoke with. There is a beautiful passage in the Phaedrus, one of Plato's later dialogues, where Socrates is walking outside the city walls with a young man named Phaedrus, and Phaedrus asks him whether he believes a certain mythological story is true. Socrates pauses and says something unexpectedly personal. He says that he doesn't have time for mythological investigations because he hasn't yet finished investigating himself. He says that it seems ridiculous to him to inquire about things outside himself while he is still ignorant of what he himself actually is. Am I a simpler creature, he asks, or one of more complexity and wildness? This is the question I'm still working on. The humility of that, from one of the greatest minds in the history of civilization, a man who had spent decades questioning the best thinkers of his age, is striking and moving. He is not pretending. He genuinely means it. The investigation of the self is not a project you complete. It is a practice, a daily practice, a lifelong orientation toward honest self-awareness that you cultivate not because you will one day arrive at a final, complete self-knowledge, but because the practice itself, the daily habit of looking clearly, is what it means to be fully awake in your own life. As the night deepens around you and your breathing slows, I want to offer you something to carry into sleep. Not a command, not a demand, just a gentle question, the kind Socrates might have asked in the gentlest possible way. What do you know about yourself tonight that you didn't know a year ago? Not what has happened to you, but what do you know about yourself, your patterns, your fears, your genuine values, the places where you are stronger or more fragile than you thought? Hold that question lightly. Let it rest with you in the dark. There is a party in Athens on a warm evening in 416 BCE. The host is a poet named Agathon, who is celebrating his first victory in the dramatic competitions at the festival of Dionysus. The guests include some of the most brilliant, most beautiful, and most famous people in Athens: the comic playwright Aristophanes, the physician Eryximachus, the general and statesman Alcibiades, and of course Socrates. After dinner, as the wine is poured, and the dinner couch is comfortable, and the lamplight golden, someone suggests a theme for conversation. Each guest should give a speech in praise of Eros, the god of love, and the speeches that follow, preserved in Plato's Symposium, one of the most beautiful texts in the history of Western literature, range from charming to funny to profound. But it is the speech of Socrates that transforms the evening. Socrates says characteristically that he is no good at making speeches. He can only tell the truth in question and answer form. Then he says that his speech will be an account of what he was once taught about love, by a wise woman from Mantinea named Diotima. This Diotima, whether historical or invented by Plato, is one of the most significant figures in the Platonic corpus, a woman who teaches Socrates about the deepest nature of love, inverting the usual relationship between teacher and student, expert and novice, man and woman, in a way that was deliberate and significant. What Diotima taught Socrates about love is one of the most compressed and beautiful accounts of the philosophical and spiritual life ever written. Love, she says, begins with the love of a beautiful body. A young person sees someone beautiful and desires to be near them, to touch them, to possess them in some way. This is love's simplest and most familiar form. There is nothing wrong with it, but it is only the beginning. The lover who pays attention, who stays curious, who does not stop at the surface, begins to notice that the beauty they see in one beautiful body is not unique to that body. It is also present in different form in other beautiful bodies. The particular person they love is beautiful, yes, but beauty itself is not confined to them. It is a quality that shines, more or less brightly, through many people, many things. And so love begins to expand. The lover comes to love not just this particular beauty, but beauty in persons generally. Their love becomes less obsessive, less exclusive, less dependent on the uniqueness of a single beloved. They fall in love, in a sense, with beautiful humanity, with the quality of beauty that shines through human beings. But still, Diotima says, the lover who pays attention will notice that the beauty of the soul, the beauty of a person's character, their intelligence, their kindness, their courage, is more lasting and more valuable than the beauty of their body, which is subject to age and illness and the ordinary erosions of time. And so the lover's attention rises from physical beauty to the beauty of souls. They love a person not for how they look, but for who they are. And they discover in this rising that beautiful souls can inhabit imperfect bodies, and that the love of a beautiful soul enriches and elevates in ways that the love of a beautiful body alone cannot. And again, paying attention, the lover begins to notice that the qualities they love in beautiful souls, wisdom, courage, justice, beauty of character, are qualities that also express themselves in beautiful laws, beautiful social institutions, beautiful communities, the city that is just, the community that is wise. These are also objects of love, and a higher love than the personal, because they express the same beautiful qualities at a larger scale, with more permanence, touching more lives. And beyond beautiful institutions, the lover may eventually find themselves in love with beauty and knowledge, with the beauty of mathematics, of music, of philosophy, of the forms of understanding that express the inherent order and harmony of the world. They find themselves loving not this instance of beauty or that instance of beauty, but the beautiful itself, the form, the essence, the permanent and unchanging quality that all beautiful things share and participate in. This is what Diotima calls the ladder of love, or the ascent of Eros. From the beautiful body to beautiful bodies, from beautiful bodies to beautiful souls, from beautiful souls to beautiful practices and institutions, from practices and institutions to the beauty of knowledge, and finally to beauty itself, the form of the beautiful, permanent and complete, and independent of any particular instance. And there, at the top of the ladder, Diotima says, the lover experiences something extraordinary, a vision of the beautiful itself, not through the medium of any particular beautiful thing, not dependent on any relationship or any physical presence, but direct, immediate, a knowledge of beauty as it truly is, in itself, not as it is reflected or refracted in the beautiful things of the world. This vision, she says, is the point of it all. The purpose of love, pursued with proper attention and through proper stages, is not the possession of any particular beloved, but the birth of wisdom, the creation, in the soul of the lover, of understanding so real and so deep that it feels like a vision of something eternal. Whether you understand this literally, as a metaphysical claim about the existence of a realm of pure forms, pure beauty, pure truth, or metaphorically, as a description of how deep and sustained love expands and elevates the consciousness of the lover, it is a remarkable account of what love can be when it is not merely appetite, not merely longing, but something more patient and more capacious. The psychological truth at its heart is one that many people recognize from their own experience, that love, when it is deep and genuine and attended to honestly, teaches you things about yourself and the world that nothing else quite reaches. That being truly known by another person, or truly seeing another person, opens something in you, that the experience of loving something beautiful, a person, a piece of music, a mathematical proof, a landscape, a child's face, is one of the few experiences that simultaneously makes you feel more yourself and more connected to something larger than yourself. Socrates, at this point in his speech, is interrupted. The door bangs open, and Alcibiades staggers in, drunk, garlanded, noisy, magnificent, holding a torch, and leading a crowd of revelers. He's the most beautiful young man in Athens, and the most talented, and the most reckless and self-destructive. He is also, extravagantly and unrequitedly, in love with Socrates. And the speech Alcibiades gives about Socrates, a drunken, brilliant, heartfelt tribute from a young man who has been trying for years to seduce a philosopher he cannot have, is one of the most intimate and revealing portraits of Socrates in all the ancient literature. We will return to Alcibiades. His story and Socrates are bound together in ways that will matter enormously for everything that comes later. But for now, in the warmth of this late hour, let the ladder of Eros rest in your mind. Think of the things you love, the person or people you love most deeply, the work that matters to you, the beauty that moves you, the ideas that feel alive to you. What do they all share? What is the quality that draws you to them? You don't need to answer fully. Just feel the pull of the question, the way it opens something quiet and real at the center of you. That pull, that wondering, is what Diotima called Eros. And it is, she said, the beginning of all wisdom. Socrates never wrote anything. Every word we have attributed to him comes through the writing of others, primarily Plato, who was one of his most devoted young students, and who, after Socrates' death, spent the rest of his long life writing philosophical dialogues in which Socrates appears as the central character, asking questions and drawing out insights from his conversational partners. The question of how much the Socrates of Plato's dialogues represents the historical man, and how much he represents Plato's own philosophical views placed in the mouth of his revered teacher, is one of the most persistently debated questions in classical scholarship. Most scholars believe that the earlier dialogues, the Euthyphro, the Meno, the Apology, the Laches, represent something closer to the historical Socrates, particularly in their characteristic method of questioning and their consistent avowal of ignorance. The later, more elaborate dialogues, the Republic, the Phaedrus, the Symposium, the Phaedo, are widely believed to reflect Plato's own developed philosophical views, with Socrates as a literary vehicle. But even if the famous images in the later dialogues are more Plato than Socrates, they grew directly from the Socratic tradition, from the questions Socrates asked, and the orientation he established. And one of those images, perhaps the most famous philosophical image in Western history, is worth dwelling on tonight. It is the allegory of the cave. Imagine, Socrates says to Glaucon in the Republic, a group of prisoners, They have been in an underground cave since childhood. They are chained so that they can only look at the wall in front of them. Behind them, a fire burns, and between the fire and the prisoners, people walk, carrying objects whose shadows are cast on the wall. The prisoners, who have never seen anything else, take the shadows for reality. They develop expertise in predicting which shadows follow which. They have names for the shadows and build a kind of knowledge around them, a knowledge of the shadows as they appear on the wall of their world. Now imagine, Socrates says, that one of the prisoners is freed. He is turned around and can see the fire, and is blinded and confused by it. The objects being carried past the fire look strange and disorienting after a lifetime of only their shadows. He is dragged upward out of the cave, into the sunlight, and the sunlight is almost unbearable, so much brighter than anything he has known underground. Gradually his eyes adjust. He can see the things of the world, first shadows and reflections, then the things themselves, then the sky and the stars, and finally the sun. He understands now that the sun is the source of everything, the source of the light that makes sight possible, the source of the seasons and the growth of plants, the source in a sense of the world as it appears. And what does he do? He goes back into the cave. He goes back because now that he understands what reality actually is, he cannot simply enjoy it for himself. He has a responsibility to the prisoners who are still there, still taking shadows for reality, still building their elaborate expertise around projections on a wall. He goes back to tell them, to try to help them see, but the prisoners do not thank him. His eyes have adjusted to the sunlight, and he cannot see the shadows clearly anymore. He stumbles and makes mistakes in the shadow naming that the still imprisoned prisoners would not make. They conclude that going upward has damaged him. They do not want to be dragged toward the light. And if he persists in trying to free them, if he continues to tell them that what they see is not reality, they will eventually kill him. The allegory ends there. Its application to Socrates' life, the philosopher who came back from the light of understanding to tell his fellow citizens that what they took for reality was shadows, and who was eventually killed for his trouble, is explicit and unmistakable. But the allegory works at multiple levels, and each level is worth sitting with. At its most personal level, it is a description of the experience of genuine intellectual discovery. The moment when something you believe completely turns out to be false, or partial, or a shadow of a deeper truth. That moment is exactly as Plato describes it: disorienting, sometimes painful, initially confusing. The mind that has been in a cave of unexamined assumptions does not immediately embrace the light of clear seeing. It flinches, it retreats, it sometimes denies. Think of the major revisions of your own understanding, the times when something you were certain of turned out to be wrong, or far more complicated than you thought. The relationship you misread, the career path that seemed clearly right until it wasn't, the belief about yourself that turned out to be a story you'd been telling rather than a truth you'd been living. In each case, the initial experience was probably not relief and delight. It was probably something more uncomfortable than that, a kind of vertigo, the world slightly reorganizing itself around a new perception. That is what emerging from the cave feels like. At a broader social level, the allegory describes what education is, or should be. Not the filling of a vessel with information, but the turning of the whole person toward the light. Not the transmission of beliefs, but the liberation of the capacity to see clearly. The best teacher is not the one who tells you the most things, but the one who helps you learn to look, who shows you, through their attention and their questions, how to direct your own gaze more honestly. And at its most political and ethical level, the allegory insists on a responsibility that goes beyond personal enlightenment. The philosopher who goes back into the cave is not doing something admirable in the abstract. Plato is arguing that the person who has genuinely understood something better has an obligation to bring that understanding back to the community, not to impose it, not to dictate it, but to engage honestly with the people who have not yet made the journey upward, even knowing that the reception will be difficult and might be dangerous. This is what Socrates did every day for decades in Athens. He went back into the cave, over and over again, into the marketplace, into the gymnasiums, into the houses of the wealthy, and the halls of the powerful, questioning and probing, and gently, persistently, sometimes maddeningly insisting that the shadows on the wall were not the whole of reality. And finally, in 399 BCE, the cave pushed back. Before we follow Socrates to his trial, we need to spend time with the most complicated, most brilliant, most fatally beautiful figure in his story, Alcibiades. Alcibiades was born around 450 BCE into one of the most distinguished aristocratic families in Athens. His father was killed in battle when Alcibiades was a child, and he was raised as a ward of Pericles himself, the most powerful man in Athens, his father's cousin. He grew up, therefore, at the very center of Athenian power, comfort, and social privilege. And he was, by universal ancient testimony, extraordinarily beautiful. Not just handsome, extraordinarily beautiful, with the kind of physical presence that made people stop and stare and forget what they were doing. He was also extraordinarily gifted. His intelligence was acknowledged even by those who hated him. His charm was essentially irresistible. His oratorical skill was such that he could move the Athenian assembly to nearly any position he chose. He was courageous in battle. He served with Socrates at the Battle of Delium and saved the older man's life, and strategically brilliant when he chose to apply himself. But Alcibiades had a problem that his gifts could not solve, and that his upbringing had not equipped him to manage. He had no stable internal compass. He was brilliant, but unanchored, talented but without direction, capable of almost anything, but unable to decide, from any deep principle, what was worth doing. And he loved Socrates with a passionate, frustrated, complicated love that he would later describe in the Symposium with aching honesty. He had tried, when he was young, to seduce Socrates. He had arranged to be alone with him, had wrestled with him at the gymnasium, a common social practice among Athenian men, had finally one night slipped under Socrates' cloak in the dark and declared his feelings. Socrates' response, gently, without cruelty, with full recognition of Alcibiades' beauty and genuine affection for him, was to decline. Not because he didn't care for Alcibiades, but because what Alcibiades was offering, physical beauty, social status, the flattery of being desired by the most beautiful young man in Athens, was precisely not the currency in which Socrates traded. What Socrates wanted for Alcibiades was for him to become genuinely good, not impressive, not powerful, not admired, genuinely good. And that required the kind of slow, difficult internal work that Alcibiades was brilliant enough to understand, but always found a reason to defer. In the Symposium, years later, Alcibiades describes the experience of being around Socrates with an extraordinary mixture of admiration and anguish. He says that Socrates is the only person who has ever made him feel ashamed of himself, not in the petty social sense of embarrassment, but in the deep moral sense of genuinely recognizing the gap between what he is and what he could be. He says that when he is with Socrates, he cannot deny this gap, cannot rationalize it, cannot escape it. He has to see himself clearly, and he hates it, and he can't stay away. He compares Socrates to the bronze Silenus figures you could buy in Athenian shops, hollow statues of the ugly woodland satyr that, when opened, revealed beautiful golden figures of the gods inside. From the outside, comic, unprepossessing, a stocky bald man in a plain cloak. From the inside, when you know how to look, the most beautiful thing Alcibiades has ever seen. The tragedy of Alcibiades is the tragedy of a person who can see clearly what is good and what is right, who has a genuine moral intelligence, but who cannot maintain that vision consistently enough to live by it. He is, in the language of philosophy, Socratic, from the Greek akrasia, meaning weakness of will or lack of self-control. He knows the better thing and does the worse. He knows that the examined, principled life Socrates offers is superior to the dazzling, unprincipled life he is living, and he lives the dazzling life anyway. After Socrates' death, Alcibiades' story becomes a kind of extended negative demonstration of the consequences of moral, unanchored genius. He persuaded Athens to launch the disastrous Sicilian expedition of 415 BCE, the greatest strategic blunder in Athenian history, a massive military overreach that would ultimately cost Athens the Peloponnesian War. Suspected of sacrilege, he defected to Sparta. He advised the Spartans how to defeat Athens. He then charmed his way into the court of the Persian satrap, Tissaphernes. He switched sides again and helped Athens temporarily. He was assassinated in Phrygia in 404 BCE, probably on Spartan orders, wrapped in his famous purple cloak, still beautiful, still brilliant, still not sure which side he was on. His story haunted the memory of Socrates' trial, because when Socrates was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens, the name everyone was thinking of, the name no one had to say aloud, because it was present in every mind, in the courtroom, was Alcibiades, the most brilliant, most talented, most destructive figure of a generation, who had been, publicly and demonstrably, one of Socrates' students. The question was not whether Socrates had tried to teach Alcibiades well. He had. The question was whether it mattered, at the end of the day, what kind of teaching you offered to a man of brilliant, unruly gifts and profound moral fragility. Socrates' answer, implicit in everything he said and did, was, "It matters absolutely." That moral fragility is precisely the condition that philosophical education is designed to address. That Alcibiades' failure to be formed by the Elenchus was not a failure of the method, but a demonstration of the difficulty of the work, and of the catastrophic consequences when the work is refused. The beautiful broken vessel of Alcibiades is in this reading not an argument against Socratic philosophy. It is its most urgent argument in favor. In 399 BCCE, Socrates was 70 years old. Athens had just emerged from a catastrophic decade, the defeat in the Peloponnesian War, the Spartan-imposed oligarchy of the 30 tyrants, a brutal regime that murdered and exiled thousands of Athenians in 8 months, and the restoration of democracy. The city was wounded, suspicious, and anxious. It had lost its empire, its self-confidence, and a great many of its citizens. It was trying to reconstitute itself around a restored democracy that needed urgently to project confidence and moral authority. Into this fragile, anxious political moment, 3 Athenians, Miletus, a poet, Anytus, a politician and tanner, and Lycon, an orator, brought a formal legal charge against Socrates. The charge had 2 parts. First, impiety. Socrates was charged with not believing in the gods the city believed in, and with introducing new divine beings. The reference to his daimon, his private divine voice, was clearly in the prosecutor's mind. Second, corrupting the youth of Athens. These charges were, in the context of Athens, in 399 BCE, both genuinely serious and politically loaded. The association between Socrates and Alcibiades, whose disastrous leadership had contributed to Athens's defeat, was widely remembered. The charge of impiety tapped into a broader anxiety about the corrosive effects of sophistic philosophy and the questioning of traditional values on Athenian social cohesion. The trial was public. The jury was enormous by our standards. 501 Athenian citizens, selected by lot, the same democratic mechanism used for all Athenian juries. There were no judges, no lawyers in the modern sense. The prosecutors spoke, then the defendant, then the jury voted. Socrates could have been acquitted. Almost certainly could have been acquitted. All he had to do was what Athenian defendants routinely did. Speak humbly, acknowledge the jury's authority, perhaps express some regret, perhaps allow friends to speak on his behalf about his good character and service to the city, perhaps agree to go into exile if the charges were too serious for acquittal. The jury would probably have been satisfied, and Socrates would have walked out of the court a free man. He did none of this. Plato's Apology, which preserves what is either Socrates' actual speech or a highly faithful reconstruction of it, is one of the most astonishing documents in Western literature. In it, Socrates addresses the jury, not with humility and deference, but with a patient, consistent, absolutely unswerving insistence on the truth as he understands it. He does not apologize for his life or his method. He explains it. He defends it. He argues that it is precisely what Athens needs, and that to ask him to stop would be to ask him to be less than himself, and that he would not do this because the unexamined life is not worth living. He explains the oracle, the diamond, the method, the years of questioning. He argues that he has been performing a service to Athens, that he is to use his famous image like a gadfly on a horse. The horse, Athens, is large and well-bred, and rather sleepy, and the gadfly, Socrates, is placed by the god to keep stinging it into wakefulness. If you kill the gadfly, the horse will sleep again, and sleep for a very long time. He calls the jury as witnesses to his own poverty. If he had been a sophist, he says, charging for his teaching and becoming wealthy from it, that would be evidence of corruption. But he has taken no fees, owned almost nothing, devoted his entire adult life to the philosophical work at great personal cost. Does this look like corruption? He anticipates the objection. Why not simply stop philosophizing? And he answers it directly. If you were to let him off on the condition that he never again engaged in philosophical inquiry, he would refuse. He could not obey this command and remain Socrates. The philosophical life is not a hobby he can put down. It is who he is, and to abandon it would be to destroy the self that makes the living worthwhile. The jury found him guilty by a margin of perhaps 60 votes. Then came the sentencing phase. In Athenian legal practice, after a guilty verdict, both sides proposed a penalty, and the jury chose between them. The prosecution proposed death. Socrates was supposed to propose a counter-penalty, something serious enough to seem like a genuine concession, like a large fine or exile. Most of his friends were urging him to propose exile, which the jury would almost certainly have accepted. Instead, Socrates said, with a kind of playful seriousness that must have infuriated the jury, that what he really deserved for his years of service to Athens was free meals at the Prytaneum, the public building where Athens housed and fed its most distinguished citizens at state expense. He eventually did propose a fine, a modest one, but the spirit of defiance was unmistakable. The jury voted for death by a larger margin than they had voted for guilt. Several members who had voted for acquittal voted for death after the sentencing phase, angered apparently by Socrates' refusal to simply play the expected role of the penitent defendant. And so, the verdict was death. Socrates was taken to prison to await execution. Under Athenian law and custom, execution could not occur while a sacred ship was away, on a religious mission to Delos, and that ship happened to be away. Socrates spent approximately 30 days in prison, waiting. During those 30 days, according to the dialogues of Plato, he had a series of conversations with his friends and students that were, in their way, some of the most extraordinary of his life. He discussed the nature of the soul, the possibility of immortality, the relationship between philosophy and death, and the question of why he would not escape, as his friends urged him to, even when escape was entirely possible. The answer he gave to why he would not escape is, for many readers, the most moving and most challenging thing he ever said. We will come to it in the next chapter. But first, let us sit for a moment with the trial itself. 501 citizens voted on whether a man should die for asking questions, and the questions won. In the sense that matters most, in the sense of what the trial ultimately meant for history, for the development of philosophy, for the freedom of inquiry that is the foundation of every intellectual tradition that has contributed to the world we inhabit. The questions won. The man died. The method survived. The questions expanded, multiplied, traveled through Plato and Aristotle, and 1,000 subsequent thinkers across millennia until they reached this quiet night, in which you are lying still, and this voice in your ear, and the lingering, patient presence of those questions in your own mind. The questions won. The night before Socrates' execution was due to take place, a small man moved quietly through the darkness of Athens toward the prison where Socrates was being held. His name was Crito. He was one of Socrates' oldest friends, not brilliant, not famous, but deeply loyal, possessed of sufficient wealth to make things happen, and convinced that Socrates' death would be a catastrophic injustice that could and should be prevented. Crito had arranged everything. The guards had been bribed. A ship was waiting. Escape was not merely possible, it was essentially guaranteed. Friends in Thessaly and elsewhere were ready to welcome Socrates and provide for his remaining years. The whole apparatus of a graceful exit from an unjust situation had been quietly assembled while Socrates was sleeping. Socrates woke to find Crito sitting beside him in the pre-dawn dimness, watching him with an expression of anxious hope. "Why are you here so early?" Socrates asked. "To bring you good news," Crito said. "You can leave. Tonight, everything is arranged." Socrates listened carefully and then shook his head. Plato's dialogue, the Crito, is the account of the argument that followed, an argument that Crito thought was about practical arrangements, and that Socrates turned into something much more fundamental, a dialogue about the relationship between the individual and the law, about the obligations created by a life lived within a community, about the difference between a justice that is merely convenient and a justice that is principled. Socrates' argument, delivered, as always, in the form of a dialogue, with personified laws of Athens speaking to him in his imagination, runs like this. He has lived in Athens his whole life. He has participated in its legal and civic structures, benefited from its protections, raised children within its framework, and on numerous occasions when he could have left. At his trial, for instance, when exile was on offer, he has explicitly chosen to stay. This choosing to stay is, in Socrates' analysis, a kind of implicit agreement, a social contract, though he uses different language, between himself and the city, an agreement to abide by the city's laws, including the law that says the verdicts of courts must be respected. If he now breaks this agreement because a particular verdict has gone against him, he does several things, all bad. He harms the city by undermining its legal structures. If individuals can ignore court verdicts whenever they believe them unjust, courts become meaningless, and the entire fabric of civilized community life unravels. He harms himself by becoming the kind of person who breaks his agreements when they become inconvenient, which is a kind of moral self-destruction, a destruction of the principled self, and he invalidates his entire life's work. For 40 years, Socrates has been arguing that the just life is better than the unjust one, regardless of personal cost, that virtue is not merely instrumental, but is its own reward, that a person should care more about the quality of their soul than about their safety or comfort. If, at the moment when his principles cost him his life, he abandons them, if he reveals at the last that he did not actually believe what he spent 40 years saying, then the 40 years are a lie, and the lie would be worse than the death. There is something almost unbearably demanding about this argument, and Crito, in the dialogue, does not quite have the philosophical resources to defeat it, though he has the human resources to feel its injustice. Of course the verdict was wrong. Of course the laws are being used unjustly in this instance. Of course a good man should not die for asking questions. But Socrates is pointing towards something that goes beyond the particular injustice of his particular situation. He is making a claim about the kind of person he is, and more broadly, about the kind of person it is worth being. The kind of person it is worth being, in Socrates' view, is a person whose principles hold under pressure, not just a person who believes in justice when justice is comfortable, but a person who continues to act justly when it costs them something. Not just a person who says the unexamined life is not worth living, but a person who lives the examined life even when the examination leads somewhere painful. Socrates does not escape. He stays, he waits, and in the morning he dies. But the argument he made in that prison cell, the argument that a person's integrity is worth more than their life, that the coherence of your principles under pressure is the truest measure of who you are, has echoed down through 24 centuries and is still being felt in this very quiet moment, in the dark of your room, in the slow rhythm of your breathing. What do you believe enough to hold on to when it costs you something? Not in a dramatic sense, not necessarily in any sense that involves physical danger, but in the ordinary daily sense, the belief you won't abandon to avoid an awkward conversation, the value you won't compromise for a small professional convenience, the thing you know to be true that you will say aloud, even when saying it puts you in an uncomfortable minority. Socrates stayed in his cell, not to be heroic. He stayed because he had examined his values honestly enough to know which ones were real, and because he understood that the coherence of a life is not just a philosophical nicety, but the thing that makes a life genuinely yours. He stayed because he knew who he was, and that knowing, that patient, hard-won, honest knowledge of the self, was in the end the thing that all the years of questioning had been building toward. There is a scene in Plato's Phaedo that I want to offer you gently in the calm of this night, because it is one of the most serene and moving depictions of death in all of literature. The Phaedo is set in the prison on the day of Socrates' death. His friends are gathered around him. Plato, notably, was not present. He was ill, and the slight awkwardness of this detail, recorded honestly, is one of many small touches that give the dialogue its quality of truthful memory. Crito is there. Phaedo, the young man who recounts the day to a friend, is there. Several others, whose names are recorded with the loving specificity of someone trying to fix the memory of an important day. They have been talking for hours about the soul, whether it survives death, what form it might take, whether the philosophical life is a kind of preparation for death, in the sense that it accustomed the philosopher to separating reason and truth from the body's appetites and distractions. The arguments are intricate and beautiful, and not entirely convincing, and several of those present are not fully persuaded, and say so. And Socrates responds to their doubts with patience and care. Toward the end of the afternoon, the jailer comes. He tells Socrates it is time. He says that he has known many condemned men, and that most of them rage at him and curse him for bringing the poison. He says to Socrates, "I think you are the noblest and gentlest and best man who has ever come to this place," and he weeps. Socrates tells him not to weep and thanks him with genuine warmth. The poison is brought, hemlock, a bitter liquid prepared from the plant of the same name, which causes paralysis from the extremities upward, a slow numbness that climbs through the body over perhaps 20 minutes. Socrates asks, with a kind of practical interest, what he should do. Should he pour a libation to the gods? The jailer says the amount is barely enough for one dose. Socrates says, never mind. One can offer a prayer to the gods anyway, for good fortune in the journey. And he prays, briefly, quietly. He drinks the cup, without any expression of reluctance or fear. His friends are weeping. Crito is weeping. Even the usually composed Phaedo breaks down. Socrates looks around at them with something between affection and mild exasperation, and says, "What are you doing? I sent the women away, precisely to avoid this kind of disturbance. Be calm, be strong." He walks around for a while. When his legs begin to feel heavy, he lies down. The jailer examines him periodically, pressing on his feet and legs, asking if he can feel anything. "No," Socrates says. He cannot. The numbness climbs to his knees, his thighs, his stomach. He says near the end, and this is one of the most discussed and debated final words in all of ancient literature. He says to Crito, "I owe a cock to Asclepius. See that the debt is paid." Asclepius was the god of healing. The offering of a cock was what a Greek patient made when they recovered from an illness. The interpretation that has moved readers for centuries is this: that Socrates, in his last words, was suggesting that death was a kind of recovery, that the life we live in the body is the illness, and death is the cure, the healing, the return to health. It was a final piece of philosophical wit from a man who had maintained his equanimity, his humor, and his conviction all the way to the end. Crito says he will see to it. Is there anything else? There is no answer. Socrates was dead. He was 70 years old. He had spent perhaps 30 years in active philosophical practice, wandering Athens, asking questions, declining payment, making enemies and devoted friends in roughly equal measure, and insisting, with a patience and consistency that only seems more remarkable as the centuries accumulate around it, that the most important work any human being can do is to examine their own life honestly. In the quiet of this moment, let that life rest for a moment in your mind. An old man in a plain cloak, barefoot, asking questions. And the question he is asking softly, in the dark: how are you living? Let us spend some time now with the central ethical claim of Socratic philosophy, the one that underlies everything else, and that is both the most counterintuitive and ultimately the most illuminating. Virtue is knowledge. This is the claim. The technical Greek term is the Socratic paradox, that to know what is good is to do what is good, that wrongdoing is always a form of ignorance, that no one does wrong willingly. They do wrong because they have mistaken the wrong thing for the good thing, because they do not correctly understand what is actually beneficial for them or for others. This sounds strange. We know from our own experience what it is to know the right thing and do the wrong thing anyway. We know the experience of eating the thing we shouldn't eat, or saying the thing we shouldn't say, or choosing the path of least resistance when a harder but better path was clearly visible. Acrasia, weakness of will, the doing of what we know is wrong, seems to be a universal human experience, not a rare exception. Socrates seems to be denying this. He seems to be saying that genuine knowledge of the good makes right action automatic, that the person who truly understands what virtue is cannot act viciously, any more than the person who truly understands that fire burns will willingly touch it. But what he means by knowledge is more specific and more demanding than we might initially assume. Consider the person who knows they shouldn't eat the whole box of chocolates. In what sense do they know this? They know it abstractly. They can state the proposition, eating too much sugar is not good for me. But in the moment of temptation, this abstract knowledge is competing with a much more vivid and immediate perception. This looks good. It will taste good. The pleasure is immediate and certain. The harm is distant and theoretical. The knowledge of the harm has not been fully integrated, has not been made real enough, vivid enough, present enough to the actual decision-making apparatus of the mind. What Socrates means by genuine knowledge of the good is knowledge that has this quality: fully integrated, fully present, fully real. Knowledge that is not merely a proposition you can state, but a living perception that shapes your actual experience of the situation. When you genuinely know, in this deep, integrated, fully present way, that courage is good and cowardice is shameful, you don't face the burning building and think abstractly, courage is good, but this fire is very hot. You simply act courageously, because the knowledge of what courage is has been made so real by philosophical reflection that it reorganizes your perception of the situation from the inside. The psychological insight here is actually well supported by modern research on moral psychology. Psychologists Jonathan Haidt and others have documented that moral behavior is not primarily the result of deliberate moral reasoning. It is primarily the result of moral intuition, rapid, largely unconscious perceptual responses to situations that have been shaped by experience, habituation, and the stories and values you have internalized. The slow, deliberate moral reasoning we do is often post hoc, rationalization of intuitive responses rather than the actual cause of moral choices. This means that moral education, the formation of a genuinely good person, as opposed to a person who can reason correctly about ethics, is primarily about the formation of moral perception, about training the intuitive, immediate, perceptual responses of the moral agent so that they automatically see situations clearly, see the relevant moral features vividly, and respond to them appropriately. And this is exactly what Socrates' method is designed to do. The elenchus, the patient, systematic cross-examination of moral concepts, is not primarily an intellectual exercise in the narrow sense. It is a practice of making moral concepts more real, more vivid, more integrated into the actual fabric of the practitioner's experience. Every time you genuinely wrestle with what justice means in a particular case, every time you work through the competing considerations honestly and fully, rather than defaulting to habit or convention, you are not just acquiring information. You are training your moral perception. You are making justice more real to yourself. And the person for whom justice has become genuinely real, who perceives injustice vividly, immediately, as a kind of wrongness that is as obvious as a dissonant note in music, is the person who will act justly, even when it costs them something, not because they have steeled themselves against temptation by an effort of will, but because the temptation to act unjustly does not, for them, appear attractive. They can see clearly and immediately what it would cost them, in terms of the quality of their own soul, their own self-relation, their own integrity, to choose the unjust path. This is the deepest meaning of virtue as knowledge. Not that intellectual understanding is all you need to be good, but that genuine, integrated, fully present understanding of what is good reorganizes your perception and your motivation so that being good becomes, in a sense, the path of least resistance. Not easy, never easy, because the world is complicated, and virtuous action often requires real sacrifice, but natural, consistent with who you most deeply are. The work of philosophy for Socrates was the work of becoming more fully yourself, not the self you happen to be, as a result of unexamined habit and inherited convention, but the self you actually are, when you see clearly and honestly and fully what is good, and what it costs to be good, and why it is worth the cost. That is the work of a lifetime, and it begins tonight, in the quiet of this moment, with nothing more than a willingness to look. There is a strand of Socratic philosophy that surprises many readers who encounter it for the first time, because it seems to cut against everything we naturally associate with wisdom and creativity. Socrates distrusted the poets, not in a simple-minded way. He clearly loved poetry, quoted it with evident pleasure, and understood its beauty and power. But he distrusted something specific about how poets related to their own work, and about the authority that Athenian culture granted them by virtue of their creative gifts. The poets of ancient Athens, the great tragedians, the lyric poets, the epic tradition inherited from Homer and Hesiod, occupied a cultural position roughly analogous to the greatest artists, musicians, and thinkers of our own time, people whose creative works were widely considered to contain profound wisdom, to embody cultural values, to say things about the human condition that ordinary discourse could not reach. Socrates, in his systematic investigation of who actually knew what they claimed to know, had gone to the poets, and what he found troubled him. The poets, when asked to explain what they meant by their most celebrated and apparently profound passages, could not. They could not say, in clear prose, what their verses were about. They could not explain the wisdom they were supposed to embody. And crucially, Socrates noticed this with great interest. The poets themselves seemed to understand this. They did not claim to know what they were saying. They claimed rather to be inspired, to be vehicles through which the muses or the gods spoke, vessels of a wisdom that passed through them without being fully possessed by them. Socrates took this seriously. He did not dismiss it as false modesty. He genuinely believed that poetic inspiration was real, that poets did, in some genuine sense, receive their works as gifts from somewhere beyond themselves. The Ion, a short dialogue in which Socrates interviews a rhapsode, a professional reciter and interpreter of Homer, contains a famous image. Inspiration passes from the muses to the poet, like a magnet magnetizing a series of iron rings. The poet transmits to the rhapsode to the audience, each link in the chain charged with the original divine force. The problem for Socrates was not that inspiration was false. It was that inspiration was not understanding. The poet who receives a beautiful verse from beyond themselves does not thereby understand what makes it true or good. The rhapsode who can move audiences to tears with a passage about the grief of Achilles does not thereby understand grief or heroism or loss at the level of philosophical understanding. And yet, this was Socrates' concern. The cultural prestige of the poet, the emotional power of the poetry, led people to grant the poet an authority to speak about the good and the beautiful that was not earned by genuine understanding. The verses were beautiful. Therefore the poet must be wise. But this does not follow. The vessel through which something beautiful passes is not necessarily enriched by the passage. The deeper worry was about the effects of poetry on the audience. Powerful poetry, particularly tragic poetry, the kind that made Athenian audiences weep at the sufferings of Hecuba or the fall of Oedipus, engaged the emotional life of the audience in ways that were not governed by reason. The audience allowed themselves to feel deeply, to be moved, to be carried away, without simultaneously subjecting those feelings to examination. And Socrates worried that this kind of unexamined emotional engagement was a form of moral education in reverse, that it trained the emotional life without training the understanding that should govern the emotional life. This worry connects to something he observed about how people form their moral convictions, not primarily through reasoning, but through stories. The stories we hear, the emotional experiences we have in response to those stories, the characters we identify with, and the values those characters embody. These shape our moral intuitions and our moral perceptions in ways that are powerful, precisely because they are not mediated by conscious reflection. If the stories are good stories, stories that genuinely embody wisdom, that depict virtue and vice accurately, that produce appropriate emotional responses to appropriate objects, then this is fine, and perhaps better than rational argument, as a means of moral formation. But if the stories embody questionable values, or if they produce sympathy for the wrong things, or if they confuse the emotionally powerful with the morally good, then they are doing something potentially harmful to the moral formation of their audience. Socrates was, in this sense, one of the first critics of cultural influence, the first thinker to ask, systematically, not just whether art is beautiful, but whether it is good, not whether it is pleasurable, but whether it is beneficial, not whether it moves us, but whether it moves us toward what is genuinely worth being moved by. The question he was asking about poetry, we can ask today about every form of media and entertainment we consume, not with hostility or suspicion, but with the Socratic interest in examining our own experience honestly. What values are these stories embodying? What emotional responses are they training in me? What picture of human life are they reinforcing? And is that picture accurate? This is not a call to consume only improving and educational content. It is a call to examine honestly what you consume and what it does in you, to watch yourself watching, and to bring the same patient honesty to the experience of art that Socrates brought to everything else, because the stories you live with shape who you are in ways that rational argument often cannot. Socrates knew this. It was why he cared so much about the stories. Here is something that may seem obvious, but is actually easily missed, especially by anyone who has encountered philosophy primarily in academic contexts. Socrates was not a philosopher in the sense of someone who had views about abstract philosophical topics. He was a philosopher in the older, more literal sense of the word, a lover of wisdom. And for Socrates, the love of wisdom was not a discipline you studied, not a set of positions you held, not a professional identity. It was a way of living, a daily practice, an orientation of the whole person toward honest understanding, carried into every conversation, every relationship, every decision. The distinction matters because it changes what we understand philosophy to be for. When Socrates asked his questions, what is justice? What is courage? What is piety? He was not engaged in an abstract intellectual exercise, like solving a puzzle or working out a theorem. He was asking questions about how to live, and his interlocutors, the politicians and generals and craftsmen, and young men and merchants and priests who found themselves in conversation with him, were being asked these questions not in the abstract, but about themselves. What is justice? Is really asking, how should you act in relation to other people? What is courage? Is asking, what does it look like to face what life asks of you with integrity? What is piety? Is asking, how should you relate to what is larger than yourself? The philosophical dialogue was, in Socrates' practice, a form of moral and psychological investigation, a joint examination by two people working together honestly of how a human being should live. The abstract questions were never merely abstract. They were always simultaneously personal. And the personal questions were never merely personal. They always opened into the universal. This integration of the personal and the universal, the practical and the theoretical, The lived question and the examined question is what made Socrates' method feel so different from anything that had come before. The Sophists, his contemporaries, taught rhetoric and argumentation for a fee. They helped people win debates, not live better. The natural philosophers of the previous generation, Thales, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, asked grand questions about the nature of reality and the structure of the cosmos, but they did not ask them in the intimate, personal, two-person format of the Socratic dialogue. Socrates brought philosophy down from the sky and into the street, from the cosmos to the self, from the impersonal to the personal, and in doing so, he invented something, a way of engaging with philosophical questions that has proved over 2,500 years to be one of the most durable and most humanly significant forms of inquiry ever developed. The philosopher Pierre Hadot, in his remarkable work on ancient philosophy, describes what he calls spiritual exercises, practices of attention, of meditation, of reading and conversation, and self-examination that the ancient philosophers understood as the essential practical content of their philosophical schools. Philosophy for the ancients was not primarily a matter of theory, but a matter of practice, a set of exercises for the mind and soul, analogous to the exercises an athlete performs for the body, designed to produce not knowledge in the abstract, but transformation in the person. For Socrates, the primary spiritual exercise was the dialogue itself, the sustained, honest, mutual investigation of moral questions with another person. This exercise was transformative, not primarily because it produced correct answers, though sometimes it did, but because the practice of honest examination, repeated regularly and consistently, gradually reshaped the practitioner's perception, their values, their emotional responses, their relationship to themselves. You become slowly someone who sees more clearly, not because you have learned more facts, but because you have practiced looking honestly. And the extraordinary thing about this practice is that it is available to everyone, in every era, in every culture, with no equipment and no institution and no fee. All it requires is the willingness to ask honest questions of yourself and of the people you are in genuine relationship with, and the patience to sit with the answers, however uncomfortable they turn out to be. Socrates practiced this in the streets and markets of Athens. You can practice it in the quiet of your own mind, tonight, as you rest. Not as a performance of philosophy, not as an intellectual exercise, simply as the honest attention you bring to your own experience. We have spoken of Alcibiades and Plato and Crito, but Socrates' circle was wide and varied, and the quality of the friendships within it tells us something important about the kind of person he was, and the kind of community philosophy, practiced honestly, can create. Friendship, philia, was one of the great Socratic themes, and it was not a passive or sentimental theme. Socrates believed and argued explicitly that genuine friendship was one of the highest goods available to a human being. Not the friendship of convenience or of mutual benefit, not the friendship based on pleasure or use, but the deep friendship based on shared virtue, the friendship that arises when two people who are both genuinely trying to be good and to understand the good enter into a sustained relationship of honest engagement with each other. This kind of friendship, Socrates argued, and Aristotle would later elaborate the argument with great precision, is the rarest and most valuable form of human relationship. It is rare because it requires both parties to actually be engaged in the serious project of moral and intellectual self-improvement, which most people, most of the time, are not. It is valuable because it creates a space in which both parties can be more fully honest, more fully reflective, more fully themselves than they can be in any other context. A true friend in this sense is someone who helps you see more clearly, who reflects your blind spots back to you without cruelty, who challenges your self-deceptions with gentleness and genuine care, who cares more about your actual goodness than about your comfortable good opinion of yourself. This is a demanding description of friendship, and it is clearly the description of something that Socrates himself embodied in his relationships. Crito, who came to the prison in the dark, before dawn, was not Socrates' intellectual peer. He was not a philosopher. He was a plain, loyal, practical man who happened to love Socrates with the unglamorous devotion of someone who has simply been formed, over many years, by consistent contact with genuine goodness. The depth of that devotion, the depth of what a good person's consistent presence can produce in those around him, is one of the moving sub-themes of the dialogues. Plato, who was young when Socrates died, and who spent the rest of his life in the philosophical project that the master had begun, represents a different kind of friend, the one who carries forward what the beloved has begun, who ensures that the work is not lost, who finds in the loss itself a kind of creative imperative. Phaedo, who narrates the death scene with such loving detail, represents something else again, the person whose entire life was redirected by a single encounter with genuine philosophical seriousness. Phaedo was, before he met Socrates, a slave, captured in war, brought to Athens, used. Socrates helped arrange his freedom. Phaedo spent the rest of his life as a philosopher, founded a philosophical school in his home city, and left behind nothing but the memory of an afternoon in a prison that Plato turned into the most beautiful death scene in ancient literature. There is something deeply humanizing about the social world of Socrates, the way it crossed class and age and conventional social boundaries to create a community of genuinely honest, genuinely engaged people. Slaves and aristocrats, old men and young men, military heroes and tradesmen, beautiful people and plain ones, all drawn together not by status or convention, but by a shared orientation toward truth and the genuine desire to understand and to live well. This is what the philosophical community can be at its best. Not an elite club for the intellectually gifted, not an institution for the production of academic papers, but a community of practice, a group of people committed to the ongoing, daily, never-finished work of honest self-examination, supporting each other in that work, calling each other gently back to it when they drift, celebrating each other's genuine insights, and being honest about each other's blind spots. Modern psychology has confirmed, through decades of research on well-being and flourishing, that the quality of a person's close relationships is the single most powerful predictor of their happiness, health, and sense of meaning. Not wealth, not achievement, not status, relationships. The presence in your life of people who genuinely know you and genuinely care about your good. Socrates knew this. His community, the loose, warm, perpetually arguing, deeply devoted circle that gathered around him in the Agora and the gymnasiums, was not incidental to his philosophical project. It was the medium in which the project lived. As you rest in the quiet of tonight, think of the people in your life with whom you are most genuinely yourself, with whom you can be honest without fear. Who cares about your actual goodness, not just your comfort? These are your philosophical friends. Hold them with the value they deserve. The unexamined life is not worth living. These words, spoken by Socrates at his trial, preserved in Plato's Apology, are perhaps the most famous sentence in the history of Western philosophy. They are quoted in philosophy classrooms, in commencement speeches, in self-help books, in the margins of journals, in the minds of thoughtful people across 24 centuries of living and dying and trying to understand what it's all for. But what do they actually mean? And are they true? Let us approach this slowly, because the sentence is easy to quote and easy to misread. First, what does examined mean? We have been exploring this throughout tonight's journey. The examined life is the life in which you ask, regularly and honestly, the fundamental questions. What do I believe? Why do I believe it? What do I value? Does my life actually reflect those values? What kind of person am I becoming through the choices I make day by day? Are the habits and patterns of my life moving me toward the person I most deeply want to be, or away from it? Examination does not require formal training in philosophy. It does not require books or degrees or a particular vocabulary. It requires only the willingness to slow down periodically and look, really look, at your own life, your own mind, your own choices, with honesty and patience and the courage to see clearly what is actually there. Second, and more controversially, is the unexamined life not worth living? Is Socrates right? The most common objection is that this seems wildly too strong. There are billions of human beings who live their lives without ever engaging in a formal philosophical self-examination, who live with genuine decency, love their families faithfully, work with integrity, experience beauty and joy, and meaningful connection, and who never ask, in any explicit way, what justice is, or whether their beliefs are philosophically coherent. Are their lives not worth living? This objection misses something important. Socrates is not saying that people who haven't read philosophy are living worthless lives. He is saying something more specific, that a life in which the question of how to live is never raised, in which values are inherited and applied by rote, in which the self is never honestly examined, in which the gap between professed principles and lived choices is never acknowledged. That life is, in a meaningful sense, not fully alive, not fully present to itself, not fully the life of the particular irreplaceable person who is living it. The difference between the examined and unexamined life is not primarily a difference in intellectual sophistication. It is a difference in wakefulness, in self-possession, in the degree to which your life is genuinely yours, shaped by your genuinely held values, chosen from genuine understanding, lived from the inside, rather than merely performed for outside approval. Most of us live in some mixture of the two. We are awake in some areas of our life and asleep in others. We examine some of our beliefs and habits honestly and avoid examining others. We are genuinely ourselves in some relationships and somewhat performed in others. We make some choices from deep principle and other choices from thoughtless convention. The examined life, as Socrates envisions it, is not a destination you arrive at. It is a direction you move in, a practice you maintain, a quality of attention you cultivate, day by day, in the small and large choices that constitute a life. And the argument for moving in that direction is not complicated. The unexamined life can still be pleasant, can still be socially successful, can still be outwardly admirable. But it is not fully free, because freedom, in the deepest sense, requires self-knowledge. You cannot make genuinely free choices without knowing who you are, what you actually value, what kind of person you are trying to become. Without that knowledge, you are at the mercy of habit and convention, and the emotional weather of the moment. You go where circumstances take you. The examined life is the life in which you choose where you go. And there is a final beauty in Socrates' statement that is easy to miss. He does not say the examined life is better. He says the unexamined life is not worth living. The word worth is important. Worth is not merely comparative, a bit better than, a bit more preferable to. Worth is about value in the deepest sense, about what justifies the effort and the gift of being alive at all. Socrates believed that the fundamental dignity of a human life, what makes it genuinely valuable, genuinely worth having been given, is the capacity for self-reflection, for moral growth, for the conscious, chosen development of the self towards something genuinely good. Without that capacity being exercised, a human life is not quite fully human. It is alive in the biological sense, but not in the fullest sense, not in the sense that justifies the improbable gift of consciousness and self-awareness, and the ability to ask, in the darkness of a quiet night, why am I here? What am I doing? Who am I becoming? These questions asked honestly are the beginning of the examined life. You are asking them now. That is enough. There is a dimension of Platonic thought, growing directly from Socratic questioning, that takes us beyond ethics and into something harder to hold and more beautiful, like trying to cup water in your hands. When Socrates asked, "What is justice?" he was not asking about this particular just action or that particular just law. He was asking about justice itself, the quality that makes any just thing just, the thing that all just things share, and by virtue of which they deserve to be called just. This question, what is the form, the essence, the defining nature of a thing, led Plato to one of the most distinctive and most debated theories in the history of philosophy, the theory of forms. The theory, in its basic outline, runs something like this. Consider a beautiful object, a beautiful face, a beautiful piece of music, a beautiful landscape. Now consider another beautiful object, and another. What do they share? What is the quality, the beauty, that all three possess, and that makes it appropriate to apply the same word, the same concept to all of them? We cannot point to beauty in any of these objects the way we point to their redness or their roundness. Beauty is not a physical property, not a location in space, not something that can be measured. It is something the beautiful object participates in, or instantiates, or reflects, but which is not identical to the object itself, since the object can cease to be beautiful. It ages, it decays, it fails to please in different light, while beauty itself remains what it is. What is beauty itself? What is justice itself? What is goodness itself? Plato's answer, and this is where he extended Socratic questioning into metaphysics, is that these are real entities, not physical entities, not located in space and time, not perceptible by the senses, but more real, in a significant sense, than the physical things that instantiate them. The beautiful things of the world come into existence and pass away, appear beautiful to some, and not to others, are beautiful in some respects, but not others. Beauty itself does not come into existence, does not pass away, is always and completely and purely beautiful, is not more beautiful from one perspective or in one culture than another. This is the world of forms, the eternal, perfect, unchanging archetypes, of which the things of the world are imperfect, changing, temporary instances. The form of beauty, the form of justice, the form of goodness. These are, for Plato, the most real things that exist, and the philosopher who ascends toward them, through the patient practice of dialectic, is ascending toward genuine reality, rather than moving through the shadows and appearances that constitute ordinary experience. You can hear in this the direct continuation of the allegory of the cave. The prisoners see only shadows. The philosopher, having turned toward the light, eventually sees not just the objects, but the sun itself, which Plato identifies with the form of the good, the highest form, the source of being and truth for all other forms. This metaphysics is either the most profound insight in the history of human thought or an elaborate and beautiful philosophical error, depending on whom you ask. The debate has continued without resolution for 24 centuries, but even if you are skeptical of the literal metaphysical claim, even if you don't believe there is a realm of transcendent forms existing independently of the physical world, something of great value that can be salvaged from the Platonic insight. What Plato is pointing at is the experience of encountering an instance of something, a truly just act, a genuinely beautiful thing, a moment of genuine courage or genuine kindness, and feeling in that encounter a kind of recognition that goes beyond the particular instance, a recognition that what you are seeing is an instance of something that has always been and always will be true and beautiful and good, a recognition that the particular beautiful face is not where the beauty lives. The beauty lives somewhere that the particular face is only reflecting. This experience, the experience of encountering the universal through the particular, is one of the deepest pleasures available to a conscious human being. It is what great art does to us, what profound music does, what a clear moral example does, what a genuine philosophical insight does. It makes us feel for a moment that we have glimpsed something permanent and real behind the flux of appearances. Whether that feeling is pointing at a genuine metaphysical reality, a world of forms, or whether it is pointing at something within the structure of the mind itself, the mind's capacity for abstraction, for the recognition of patterns, for the apprehension of universals. It is pointing at something real, something important, something worth attending to. The forms are Plato's account of what it feels like to really understand something, not just to have a fact, but to genuinely grasp a truth, to feel it click into place, to feel the recognition that this has always been so, that it could not be otherwise. The satisfaction that comes from genuine understanding is, in Plato's account, a form of contact with the eternal. This is philosophy's deepest promise, not just better thinking, not just clearer arguments, but occasional contact with something that feels, unmistakably, like truth. You have felt this, perhaps in a piece of music that seemed to say something that could not be said in words, perhaps in a sentence in a book that captured something you had always known, but never articulated, perhaps in a moment of moral clarity that cut through confusion with surprising simplicity, perhaps in a mathematical proof, or a scientific principle, or the sudden understanding of how two things you had always kept separate are actually the same thing at a deeper level. That feeling, that sudden wordless recognition of something true, is what Plato spent his life trying to understand. It is what Socrates spent his life trying to help people reach. It is available to you too. Always was. There is a question that underlies all of Socratic ethics, a question that Socrates considered the most important question a human being can ask, and that he addressed from various angles in essentially every philosophical conversation he had. What does it mean to live well? What does it mean to flourish? What is eudaimonia? The Greek word eudaimonia is usually translated as happiness, but this translation loses something important. The English word happiness tends to connote a feeling, a positive emotional state, an experience of pleasure or contentment or joy. Eudaimonia is something different, a quality of life, an objective condition of human flourishing that may or may not coincide with pleasant feelings in any given moment. Eudaimonia is best understood as something like living well and doing well, a life that is going well in the deepest and most genuine sense, not in the sense of being comfortable or successful or admired, but in the sense of actualizing your distinctively human capacities, living in accordance with your genuine values, being genuinely good rather than merely appearing good, achieving the kind of integrated, coherent, authentically human life that is most worthy of a conscious, rational, moral creature. Socrates' fundamental ethical claim is that genuine eudaimonia, genuine human flourishing, requires virtue, not virtue as a means to happiness, as if virtue were a strategy and happiness the goal. Virtue as constitutive of happiness, as part of what happiness actually is. This is a strong and somewhat counterintuitive claim. It sounds as if Socrates is saying that the virtuous person is happy even when they are being tortured, even when they are suffering, even when everything they care about is taken from them. And in a way, with appropriate qualifications, that is what he is saying. The qualification is about what kind of suffering matters and what kind doesn't. Physical pain, loss of wealth, social disgrace, even death. These are what Socrates calls external goods, goods of the body and of fortune, goods that depend on circumstances outside the self. They are real goods. Socrates does not pretend that pain is pleasant or poverty comfortable. But they are not the most important goods, and their loss does not by itself constitute the loss of eudaimonia. The most important good, the good that is both necessary and sufficient for eudaimonia, is the good of the soul, the quality of your character, your values, your inner life, your relationship with yourself, the degree to which you are genuinely good, genuinely honest, genuinely courageous, genuinely just, genuinely wise, is the degree to which you are genuinely flourishing, regardless of your external circumstances. This means that a virtuous person who is poor and unpopular and sentenced to death can be living better, in the genuinely meaningful sense, than a wealthy and admired person whose inner life is dishonest and morally compromised. This sounds extreme, but consider it from the inside. Think of a time when you compromised something important, when you said something you didn't believe because it was socially convenient, or when you took an easier path that violated something you actually cared about. The external cost may have been nothing. No one may have even noticed. But you noticed. And the feeling left behind, the slight but unmistakable erosion of self-respect, the awareness that you had been less than yourself, that was a real cost, a cost that wealth and social success could not compensate for. Now think of a time when you did something genuinely good, genuinely courageous, or kind or honest, at some real cost to yourself. The external reward may have been minimal, but the feeling left behind, the warmth of having been, for once, exactly who you most want to be, was a real reward, perhaps the most real reward available. Socrates is pointing at this. The soul has its own economy, its own pleasures and pains that are deeper and more lastingly significant than the economy of external goods. And the person who understands this, who has genuinely internalized it, made it real, is freed from a great deal of the anxiety and striving that consumes most people's lives. They are no longer primarily in pursuit of things that can be taken away. They are primarily in pursuit of something that can only be built from within. This does not make them passive or resigned. The Socratic person does not stop caring about the world, or their relationships, or their work. They care about these things deeply, but they care about them in the right way, as expressions and occasions of virtue, as contexts in which to practice goodness, rather than as acquisitions whose presence guarantees happiness and whose loss would be unbearable. The Stoic philosophers who came after Socrates, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, would develop this insight into an entire system of psychological practice, centered on the distinction between what is in our control, our judgments, our desires, our values, our responses, and what is not, everything else. Socrates is the source of this insight, the recognition that the most important things are internal, and that the internal is the domain of genuine freedom. On this quiet night, as the world recedes and your body rests, there is something almost restful in this thought. You cannot control most of what happens in your life. You cannot control other people's opinions of you, or the economy, or the weather, or the thousand small and large circumstances that determine the texture of your days. You can only control who you are, how you respond, what values you bring to each encounter. But that, just that, turns out to be everything. The ancient formula for a good night: know what you can't change, and let it go. Know what you can change, and tend it with care. That is enough. That has always been enough. Socrates died in 399 BCE. The Western philosophical tradition begins, in a meaningful sense, with his death, or perhaps more precisely, with Plato's grief at his death and Plato's determination to keep the conversation going. Plato was around 28 when Socrates died. He had been in the circle for several years, close enough to observe everything, and young enough to be formed by it at the deepest level. The death of Socrates, the execution of the most just and wisest man he had ever known by the democracy he had grown up believing in, was, by his own account, a shattering experience. It made him permanently skeptical of democracy's ability to govern itself wisely, and it launched him on a lifetime of philosophical work, whose explicit purpose was to understand how a city could be governed justly and how individuals could be formed to be genuinely good. He founded the Academy in a garden near Athens, named for the hero Academus, where Plato and his students worked and thought and argued for nearly a century. It is generally considered the first institution of higher learning in Western history, and it lasted for 900 years, from its founding around 387 BCE to its closing by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in 529 CE. Among its students was Aristotle, who would go on to found his own school, the Lyceum, and to produce a body of work so comprehensive and so foundational that medieval Islamic and Christian scholars would call him simply the philosopher, as if there were no need to specify. And through Aristotle, the chain extends to Alexander the Great, Aristotle's student, whose conquests spread Greek culture across the known world, to the Hellenistic schools of philosophy, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Skeptics, each developing different aspects of the Socratic inheritance, to Rome, where Cicero translated and transmitted Greek philosophy to Latin, to the medieval Islamic world, where scholars like Al-Farabi and Avicenna and Averroes preserved and extended the Platonic and Aristotelian traditions, to medieval Europe and the great scholastics, to the Renaissance, to the Enlightenment, to the philosophical traditions of the modern world. Every step in this extraordinary lineage traces back, in one way or another, to an ugly barefoot man who walked around Athens asking embarrassing questions and refused to charge for it. But the legacy of Socrates is not merely institutional or academic. It lives in something subtler and more pervasive. It lives in the idea, which we take so much for granted that we barely notice it as an idea, that the individual human being has the right and the responsibility to examine their own beliefs, to question received authority, to think for themselves. This idea, which is the foundation of democracy, of science, of freedom of conscience, of the entire tradition of civil liberties, was not obvious in the ancient world. Most cultures in most of human history have assumed that the proper response to religious, moral, and political authority is obedience, not examination. The idea that individuals should and must think for themselves, that the authority of tradition is not self-indicating, that all claims, including the claims of the most powerful institutions, are subject to rational scrutiny. This idea has Socratic roots. It lives in the practice of dialogue, the idea that truth is best approached not through monologue and proclamation, but through honest conversation between people who are genuinely trying to understand each other. Every tradition of reasoned debate, every culture of intellectual inquiry that values the exchange of opposing views, every educational practice that puts questions ahead of answers, these are Socratic inheritances. It lives in the concept of intellectual humility, the recognition that genuine wisdom begins with honest acknowledgement of what you don't know. In a world that consistently rewards confidence and penalizes uncertainty. The Socratic position that not knowing is the beginning of wisdom remains revolutionary. The best scientists know this intimately. The most important thing a good experiment can produce is a result that contradicts your hypothesis, because that result tells you something real. The most important thing a good conversation can produce is not agreement, but the honest recognition of complexity. The most important thing a good life can contain is not certainty, but the continuous, patient, curious engagement with questions that remain genuinely open. And it lives in the question itself. The question that outlasted Socrates' death, outlasted Athens' fall, outlasted the Roman Empire and the medieval period, and every subsequent century of change and upheaval and civilizational transformation. How are you living? Not in judgment, not in accusation, in genuine, caring inquiry. How are you living? We have come a long way tonight. We have walked the streets of 5th century Athens, stood in the shadow of the Parthenon, listened to conversations in the Agora, and at dinner parties and in prison cells. We have met a barefoot, stocky, ugly, magnificent man who asked questions for a living and died for them. We have followed the ladder of love and watched the prisoners in the cave and sat with the slow rising of philosophical understanding through patient, honest examination. And now, in the deepest hour of this quiet night, when the world is very still and your breathing is very slow, and the story is settling into the background of your resting mind, I want to offer you something to carry forward, not a conclusion. Socrates distrusted conclusions, preferred the open question to the closed answer, but a gathering, a placing together of the things that have emerged from this long, slow conversation. The first thing is this: you are already doing the most important thing. The willingness to spend time, even this resting, half-dreaming time, in the company of questions about how to live well, is itself a form of philosophical practice. Socrates never required his companions to solve the questions he raised. He only required that they take them seriously, that they let them in, that they allowed themselves to be genuinely uncertain, genuinely wondering, genuinely engaged. You are genuinely wondering right now, even as sleep approaches. That is enough. That is perhaps the most. The second thing is the reminder of what Socrates found in all his years of questioning, that genuine wisdom begins with honest acknowledgement of what you don't know, not as a performance of modesty, not as a rhetorical move, but as a real orientation of the mind, a real willingness to be surprised, to be revised, to find that what you were certain of was more complicated than you thought. This kind of openness is not a weakness. It is the precondition of learning. The mind that is certain has already closed. The mind that is genuinely uncertain is still alive to the world, still capable of growing, still in genuine contact with the full complexity of reality. Be a mind that is still alive to the world. The third thing is the importance of the examined life, not as an obligation, not as a burden, but as a gift. The examined life is the life that is genuinely yours, the life in which you are awake to your own values, honest about your own patterns, genuinely choosing rather than simply drifting. Most of us drift more than we choose, and the Socratic reminder is not to shame us for this, but to invite us to wake up, gently, without drama, in the ordinary moments of the ordinary day. Notice what you value. Notice whether your choices reflect what you value. Notice the gap, when there is one, with compassion and without judgment. The gap is not a failure. It is information. It is the beginning of understanding. The fourth thing is the extraordinary power of genuine friendship, of the relationships in which you are fully known and fully valued and fully challenged to be your best self. These relationships are rare and precious and worth more than almost any external achievement. Tend them, be present to them, be honest within them. And the fifth thing The thing I want to leave you with, as you slip towards sleep, is the simplest and most difficult. You are enough to begin with. Socrates did not begin with anything extraordinary. He was the son of a stonecutter and a midwife in a small Mediterranean city. He was ugly and poor, and wrote nothing. He had no credentials and no institutional backing, and no guaranteed audience. He had only his own honest attention, his own genuine curiosity, his own willingness to ask and not know, and ask again. And from that, from the simple practice of honest attention, sustained consistently over a lifetime, something emerged that is still echoing in the mind of the world 2,500 years later. You have your own honest attention. You have your own genuine curiosity. You have your own willingness to ask questions that you do not have comfortable answers to. That is not nothing. That is not a small beginning. That is the beginning. The streets of Athens are quiet now. The Agora is empty. The markets have closed, and the Stoa is dark, and the Parthenon stands cold and white above the city in the Aegean night. Somewhere in the imagination, an old man is walking home, barefoot in the early hours, having argued all day about justice and beauty and what makes a life worth living. He stops for a moment in the dark of the street and looks up. The stars are out. They are always out. He smiles slightly, that slightly exasperated, deeply affectionate smile that Alcibiades described in the Symposium. The smile of a man who is at peace with not knowing, who finds the not knowing itself a form of richness. And then he walks on, and the night holds everything, the city and its arguments, the questions and their silences, the brief bright flare of a life fully lived, and the long patient darkness that receives it. You are held in that darkness now. Let it be enough. Let your breath be slow. Let the questions rest. Let Socrates walk on into the ancient night, still wondering, still free, and sleep.